numerous awards, including the Smithsonian Artists Research Fellowship, the George A. and Eliza Gardner Howard Foundation Fellowship, the Wivina de Meester Prize for Commissioned Public Art, and the very prestigious John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. She's exhibited widely, including the 2008 Whitney Biennial, Margate's Turner Contemporary, Barnes Foundation Philadelphia, the Groningen. She's German as well, you see. So
my mother's German.
She knows her German. In Bruges, in Belgium, the Corcoran Gallery of Art, Washington, Bass Museum, Miami, Center for Contemporary Art, Warsaw, Pennsylvania Academy, Philadelphia, the Whitney Museum at Altria, New York. The Disappointed Tourist itself has traveled to the UK, USA, Austria, and Poland, and we're thrilled to have the Irish Premier here in the Butler Gallery. And just to kick off, why don't I just ask you, Ellen, to give us a bit of background on your practice in general and your circuitous route to working in the visual arts, because you studied law and you were a lawyer as well, and so be interested, I'm sure, for the audience to hear how you came to visual art, but you did have a background doing law for a while.
It's true, I am such a disappointment to my parents. It's really, they still ask me sometimes, you sure you don't want to give this up? It's a bit late now. You have to do so much remedial work.
They must be so proud of you now, with the work you've done around the world.
No, I think like a lot of people, I couldn't really imagine being able to support myself as an artist. So I always wanted to be an artist from age about 5 on. I remember I had this memory that I thought was apocryphal, where I went to Beaune in France, and there's this amazing Roger van der Weyden Last Judgment with this beautiful glowing red hot sword. It's just like super dramatic, and I was just like completely floored, and I was like 5, and I had this memory of being left there while everyone went and had lunch, and I asked my mother, and I said, that can't have happened. And she said, oh no, we left you there with the priest because you refused to leave. And I was like, oh, so it did actually happen. And I remember from that time on, I was just, the idea that somebody made something that was so amazing, I thought, that's what I want to do. So I was always drawing. I was also always selling little maps of my village to other people, and drawings of boy bands to other little girls. I was always making stuff and just distributing it in some way. But I couldn't really imagine how I would support myself. It wasn't something where I went to the Hochschule der Künste after I finished my studies in history and literature, and which my parents were paying for it, so I didn't think I could. They were just like, well, you're not doing art, and I said, good point. So then I went. So I dropped out of the Hochschule der Künste and decided to get a law degree. But then it just didn't.
You practiced for a few years.
I did practice for 3 years. I did a lot of drawings of my secretary. And then after 3 years, I had enough money, so I thought, well, I just quit for a year, and then I'll just be an artist, and that was that. So.
And I suppose in general, it would be interesting to know how you came to the Disappointed Tourist. I mean, you've done some incredible public bodies of work. You probably had a relationship with a commercial gallery to begin with, but you've been doing these major projects for many years, and what culminated with the Disappointed Tourist? I know it came out beginning in 2019. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how this body of work emerged.
I think this is an example of why sometimes I can be a tiny bit challenging for some of the galleries that I work with, because I do make kind of large, crazy projects, though I also make smaller things which makes them happy. But in this case, it really came out of a number of things. I've always been a very nostalgic person myself. I mean, there were some water meadows near where I grew up, and they got destroyed in Dorset. And I remember for years I would walk past with my eyes closed so I wouldn't have to see what had happened. Which I'm sure that all of us most people can relate to. And I remember being really upset when Trump started this whole MAGA, Make America Great Again movement, because everyone was saying, oh, well, when was it great? Great for who? Obviously it wasn't great for racial minorities or for women, but I thought it's also actually not fair to nostalgia, because we're all nostalgic. I mean, I live in a city of immigrants. People have nostalgia for what they've left behind. I live in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. I walk down the street and I'm nostalgic for the way it once was. And I thought, even if you stay in one place and it doesn't change, you still have nostalgia for your childhood. It's an inescapable part of the human condition. And so I thought, well, like most things, if you look at something more closely, it's always more interesting than people think. So this idea of nostalgia being inherently toxic or being inherently reactionary, I was like, I'm just not sure that's really true. And I also thought that nostalgia could maybe be a force for good. It could be something that gives us empathy for other people in other places. We've all lost things. And also it's a way of getting people to feel included. So I wanted to make an art project at that point that could travel, and that each time, that would be very accessible to people, and that every time people could contribute. So you could come and say, well, where's my story? And the answer I could give would be like, well, send it in. So, so I started off by just emailing sort of 3,000 of my closest friends, my mailing list, with the question, is there some place that you would like to visit or revisit that no longer exists? And then things started coming in, so just bit by bit. And then suddenly, people started saying, well, can we show it? And I was like, well, it doesn't exist yet. So I had to sort of get going. And then the first place that wanted to show it was Turner Contemporary in the UK. And which is why, if you've ever looked at this and wondered, why are there so many paintings of Margate? The answer is they did a fantastic outreach program. And at the beginning, I didn't have that many things coming in. So I'd just be like, oh, well, okay, another disused public swimming place in Margate. Okay, but another tea house in Margate. So and then, and that's been one of the great joys of it, is just that I'm not really in charge of what comes in. And it's like being set a history lesson by a completely mad history teacher, who's just like, and now you need to learn about Flipper's Roller Boogie Palace. And I'm like, okay, fair enough, So, or the Tholsel Bar here in Kilkenny, which of course I knew nothing about. So that's sort of how it happened.
So the website has a real presence too, because people are able to submit their stories, and so it's a real, I suppose, the social history. And what I'm interested in, I suppose, also is what you've learned about people. You've engaged with all kinds of people around the world on this project. Is there something new that you've learned from that kind of engagement?
Well, it's been interesting because you start to realize that people engage with this project for a wide variety of reasons. One of the biggest reasons is just, happy childhood memories. It's like house they grew up in, like Bernadette. Or it's an amusement park, or a swimming pool, or a place they went on holiday. That's a large category, and those people write these beautiful sort of stories that are all on the website about why this place meant something to them. Then during the pandemic, when this was actually a complete godsend, because I had long COVID, and it was like I would get up and I get a little email, and I would go paint a little, and I would lie down like some sort of Victorian prima donna. But people started really sending in places where they would meet. So like I got a ton of bars and restaurants and all these things during lockdown. But people also recently have started sending in more and more projects that are about calling attention to forgotten histories. So especially places that have been, impacted by war or racial conflict,
climate control,
and then and more recently, lots and lots of climate change projects or pieces that are about the human impact on nature and the landscape. I'm getting an increasing number of trees. I think at home I've got about 7 trees on the go. So
you mentioned last night. If anyone wants to hear back, Emily was on. Ellen was on the Arena RTE radio once. You can hear that interview back on playback. But you mentioned Katie Houghton's the forest, the Irish rainforest, wasn't it?
Which is particularly emotive, isn't it, really, in relation to Ireland. Yeah, I think that's the most potent one, I think, in the exhibition, isn't it?
Well, it is quite striking when you come here because it is so treeless comparatively. I mean, there's just so much grass. I'm like, wow. Because where I live in upstate New York, it was all deforested, but now it's reforested because it wasn't great farmland. So it's interesting to sort of think about how long people have been on this island, and the impact that they've had has been really, really kind of so profound. But yeah, it's each time is a new story. I can tell stories for hours about the whole thing, and then you would all just hate me. But they are amazing. And the great thing is, each time you show it, there are people who show up who suddenly, I remember some Turkish teenagers being like, "Oh my God, that's the beach that my grandmother used to go to." And I say, "Yeah, somebody else's grandmother sent it in, and she wrote this whole thing about this glamorous beach in Istanbul that's now sadly a parking lot because it got filled in." Or, I met some people who were just like, "The tic-tac-toe chicken, that was our first date," so.
There's also this other kind of socio-political dimension to it too. Like there's the Trump Tower one.
Yes.
And then there's also like Khrushchev's swimming pool.
That's fascinating, isn't it?
Which is a very fascinating one.
That one's over there. So sometimes what's interesting, you notice the same names showing up, like there are a lot of Lidos and things like that, but there also sometimes it's the same place. In that case, if you look up there, there's the church of I think it's the Blessed Savior, which Stalin dynamited in the 1930s to build a huge palace of the Soviets. And then he didn't have enough, steel, and then the war happened. And then Khrushchev eventually builds the world's largest open-air heated swimming pool. And then Putin destroys the swimming pool and rebuilds the cathedral, which is actually the place where Pussy Riot did that famous performance that they got arrested for. So two different people sent that in, but it's it's kind of fascinating, this idea that some of these places have been rebuilt, and people like there's the Larkin Hall in Ypres from World War I, which all these British soldiers wanted to keep as a memorial to the dead, but the Belgians were like, "No, we want our building back," and they rebuilt it. So sometimes people want the ruin rather than the actual building as well, which is fascinating.
So my submission to you was actually Nelson's Pillar.
Yes.
And that was a thing that I suggested was like somewhere between what it was and that moment where the IRA had blown it half up.
Yes.
And then the Irish Army came in. The whole thing about it was really comic. The Irish Army came in to blow up the other half of the pillar, and they ended up blowing out every single window in North Dublin. And then the remainder of that was then put in the back of a truck and brought to St. Anne's, and it was dumped on top of the Guinness's house, which had burnt in fire, and they had to dump things on top of it to ruin this other ruin, because people kept on setting the house on fire, and there was all sorts of tragedies about it in relation to that too. But I love this kind of like the relationship between what was a ruin and the romanticization of the ruin as well, which is very interesting.
But I think it's also, this idea, also when you think about it, a ruin is always more artistic than an actual thing because it's useless, right? If it's useful, it's not art. So, the moment a thing becomes useless, it's like, oh, it's just so much more artistic now, it's like.
But this then kind of is a very interesting intro to, say, other works you've done with ruins, because I particularly think of that church in Belgium?
It's in Belgium.
Where you made an actual church a ruin.
I did.
As an artwork.
I did. I think I'm going straight to hell. No, what happened was that there was a church, in all of Flanders was just flattened in World War I. So all of these churches were rebuilt in sort of around 1920, and there probably was one firm that built them all because they all look pretty much the same. And this one tiny village of about 600 inhabitants had a church, and there was nobody going to it anymore. They'd all kind of become godless heathens in this church. And so the local mayor of these 5 little villages was just like, another extra church, what am I going to do? And he was going to tear it down, and he went drinking one night, and he met some people who were like, oh no, you know what you should do? You should have some artist make some crazy thing with the church. So he went to the Flemish national architect, and they had a competition. And I go to, it's pouring rain, and I'm in this room with all the county councillors, and they're like, we don't have any money for upkeep. So everyone else is proposing things to put inside the church, and I was like, well, if you don't have any money for upkeep, it's going to be a ruin. So why don't we make a ruin? Everyone loves ruins. So we made it into a ruin. It was really fun. Like, we took off the steeple, we cleaned out everything on the side, and then I made this terrazzo floor that has the shadow of what the church looked like at the end of World War One. So you can sort of, and it's called repeat because of course human beings are crazy. So like they built one church and then they built another church and then they keep on, and then it gets bombed and then they build it again and then they ruin it. And I was just like, just people can't just make up their minds. Do you want a church? You do not want a church. And now people are getting married in the ruin of the church. Yeah. So
And that's the success of it, is like this ownership that the public have kind of taken ownership of. Well, that's this space, right?
Yeah, that's the great thing. I mean, I went to that opening thinking, are people going to be throwing tomatoes at me? But in fact, it's a project that really got people in the village really loved because, first of all, they didn't really have any old buildings. So suddenly they said, oh, when people come to visit us, we have some place to take them that's special and interesting. But they also have put on all this programming, so you can use it for free. So they have there's a festival, there's like a skateboarding thing. They've used it for fairs. There are all these parties there. And now, as a real vote of confidence, it has toilets. That was what the mayor said to me. He said, if it does well, it'll get toilets.
But there's something about what you do. Like when I introduced your work to Anna, I said to her that this artist is absolutely fascinating. That she has this ability to imbue an artwork with this kind of humanism or generosity that gets this buy-in from the public that I've never really seen. So there's always this, there's like a charisma that you literally plat into the work that gets people. Would you say that that's a strategy? Or
I have to admit, I don't think I'm that charismatic. I think that people bring a lot. People bring, what I think people want. Everyone wants something exciting and beautiful and cool and interesting in their lives. Like people want some kind of adventure, and they want something, and they want to be seen and listened to. And so I think when you listen to people, or you listen to things that people say, and you live a life, you just sort of start thinking, oh well, people are like, oh I wish this had happened. And you think, well, I can't actually, I can't bring back your favorite place that you used to go dancing, but I can symbolically bring it back. So I can take symbolic action. So I can't, I can't make, this. I mean, this is sort of this piece behind us on the impossibility of capturing a sunset. Is kind of for this thing that everyone was saying, when it's like, oh, everything we see is mediated through screens. Our relationship to nature is so fractured. And I thought, well, yes, that's true, but it's also kind of an amazing thing that we can see all these things. And during the pandemic, I couldn't go to Margate, which is where Turner claimed to have the loveliest skies in Europe. So I had the curator take a photograph of this one sunset, and I tried to use this one photograph to make all these different versions of it. And I was thinking, this is also just like me, because I'm a terrible photographer, and every photograph I take, I'm just like, well, could have spared myself that one. So I feel like you see some beautiful landscape and you photograph it, and you're just endlessly disappointed. And so I thought, well, that's also kind of a shout out for everyone like me who's not a great photographer. But also this sort of idea that you can't capture something sublime. There's this human desire to capture something amazing.
Like John Berger's Ways of Seeing, where he talks about people going to tourist destinations where they try and photograph everything as a way of capturing it.
Yes, and then you're not experiencing it. Like, I mean, I remember seeing an eclipse, and literally everyone is photographing the eclipse, so they have these bad, blurry images of the eclipse. And I'm just like, this might be the only eclipse I ever see, and I'm just gonna see it. It's only up for 2 minutes.
Do you have any questions, Aidan, for Eleanor?
Well, one of the things I'm really curious again about this kind of buy-in thing. I was wondering if Ellen would talk a little bit about a project that I think you broke my heart while rebuilding the heart when I heard about this project. It was something you did in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. It was a group show, I think. You were commissioned. It was about making something out of the ruins of Katrina. And I remember reading about this going, this is what the role of an artist is something like this. I think that's the thing I'm curious about, because I'm always questioning myself, what is the role of an artist?
I think a lot of the time you can, I mean, like you, I have this question all the time. It's like, how do I feel incredibly lucky to get to do what I do. I don't take it for granted. And so I do try to think, well, what can I give back? And I remember when Dan Cameron did this show called Something from Nothing, in New Orleans after Katrina, and he invited artists to come down and do things with the sort of wreckage that was left behind. And at the time, I had a newborn, so I wasn't going to be doing that. And I also felt like, what if it was my life? What if these were the ruins of my life? I just don't think I don't think it's not for me anyway. And so I thought, I just put an advertisement in the Times-Picayune, which is the local newspaper, saying, have you lost something irreplaceable to Hurricane Katrina? If so, please contact me. And people sent in all these beautiful letters, sometimes with photographs, but often just with descriptions. And so I made paintings. I printed all the stories. I had them sort of beautifully set, and then and then made paintings of the things that had been lost. And then I just gave them away at the end of the show, so that everyone got. Because I was like, I can't fix it. Like, somebody's partner had died because there was no electricity in the hospital. Somebody had lost their house. So people had lost, things that really, really were irreplaceable. And I thought, well, I can't make an art project out of this. I can just do this sort of symbolic thing, which is kind of pointless, but turned out to be meaningful for people. And I thought just the fact of being seen means something to people. And maybe that's what I can do. And that has been a sort of guiding principle for a lot of projects that I do. Okay, I try to see what a situation might want.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to that humanity. And I guess my next question would be really for Anna, like when we were talking about like how the show was going to come about, like how did you feel that this work in particular would kind of work then in the gallery context?
There were so many aspects to it that I thought would work well in Kilkenny and Ireland in general. On the practical level, the fact that it had travelled to Poland made it more accessible to us financially, and to get in a portion of this major show that you have on at Gdansk at the Lasnia Centre. But I suppose also I could see it in this space. I could see that it would inhabit it really well, and also the fact that in Kilkenny, being known as a kind of tourist city, that and in general in Ireland, we're also bound up with tourism and how one sells a country, that it would resonate with people. And I love the fact that everywhere you go, that you reach out to the public and have their involvement. So to have local people contribute and be a part of this whole installation was really special as well. So in general, I think the more I learned about you and the more I learned about the major projects that you did and the beautification of New York and these incredibly thoughtful works, so smart and real, that we would be lucky to have the disappointed tourists here in Kilkenny. So it was just wonderful that it worked out. Been a bit of a nightmare customs and travel wise, but besides all that, we're delighted to have it here, and wish it was for a longer run, but hope people will come and see it. But no, it was very poignant, and you're so skillful in what you do as well. I mean, just as a painter, you're so good as well. So I just thought this would hopefully resonate with our audiences here, which I think already we felt that it has, and I suppose that's several reasons why.
I mean, the other thing about this is a whole other kind of dimension around this show that's here now. I mean, your own curatorial project here, Anna, of like the connection between Ireland and New York, your past selves, which you were talking about earlier on.
Yeah.
This has also got another element to that to it too.
It's great for me. I lived and worked in New York for 23 years, and over the years that I've been curating shows here at the gallery, we've been lucky enough to have some amazing artists who've lived in New York, from Louise Bourgeois to Yves Sussman to Jean Silverthorne and Barry McGee, and that's been I guess we're just lucky that we've been able to have that relationship that I had built over the years, and that understanding maybe of works that would fit well here in Ireland, and we had many of those shows in the basement of Butler Gallery in the castle, and even though it was a modest space, artists loved to come to Kilkenny and have that experience of showing in a city that culture is important and people come and appreciate what they do. So for me, it's really nice to have that continuum and that connection with international artists. I think Butler Gallery in general, apart from we've always sort of focused on mostly solo shows. There's been thematic shows, and we do that occasionally, but by emerging or mid-career artists, and to have somebody important like Ellen, who's has had a really incredible career to date, and find her at this point. Usually we get people right in the middle before they're not approachable or too expensive to get. We get them at a point when it's possible, and I think it's been really important for our audiences to see international artists at work and have that standard and be able to compare and hope that audiences enjoy it. Usually our international artist happens during the August festival time when we collaborate with the Kilkenny Arts Festival, but the timing of such with Gdansk was that we had to take advantage of it and jump in when it was available to us and have it now. So it's only up for 6 weeks, but I think those 6 weeks will be well attended.
Well, I'm thrilled. And if you have any climate protests, I have the Earth has gone to a lot of climate marches in New York. The Moon is more interested in like larger political issues. The Earth is very self-centered, but you can always take it out for a spin.
Maybe while we're going around a few of the pieces there, we normally maybe with the walkthrough would go around, but because there's so many of us, we're seated today. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the piece beside, which is called Nostalgia.
Those are actually two frames. I have to thank my mother, who knows that I love ovals, and she gave me 2 oval frames that were sort of all mildewed and falling apart, and I had them for ages. And then at some point, I thought, you see these sort of gold statues, and they get renovated, and they're re-gold leafed, and suddenly they look incredibly garish. And I thought, this question of whether a thing is more beautiful the way it once was, or whether when it's aged, like at what point do you love something? Like, do you love it when it's restored? Do you love it when it's remade? So I took it in, and I had someone gild it, so with real gold, and so it's almost a mirror, so you can see yourself in the gold. So you get to decide which do you prefer, the old sort of slightly crappy version or the sort of fancy gold version,
Mirrors keep cropping up in your work all the time, don't they?
I love mirrors, yes.
So these are mirrors that are etched to create the sunsets, is that right?
Yeah, they're all engraved by hand with a diamond point. So they're just dark mirrors, plexi mirrors, and then there's a little light box behind them. It's set in a plexi frame that I made. So they're all just engraved by hand. They're meant to look a bit like Turner's engravings. So that's.
So maybe you could tell the audience here about the TV rock glacier there in the far corner.
That's just my shout out to all the melting glaciers of the world. So it's this kind of rock. It's called TV rock, and you get it sometimes in I don't know, like science museums. They sell them in little bags, and normally this is a very cracked one, so it looked like a glacier. But when you put it on something, if you stand in front of it, it works a little bit like fiber optic cable, so it brings the thing behind to the front, which is kind of a cool effect. So I like the idea of it, of one glacier and then the tiny glacier in front. So just a little.
Something to catch when you look at it. You'll see the
effect. Yeah.
And were there many pieces in Gdansk that that was a whole totally more of a retrospective show? Was it?
Well, it was the largest show was the retrospective was really at Museum der Moderne in Salzburg, so that was very large, and then it got a little bit smaller. They were just really, and there's one other big piece in it apart from what's here. That was in Gdansk, and then the one in Turner Contemporary was also very large because that was like 2/3. Each case it was sort of 2/3 of the museum.
So this show's been on tour for a little while now.
It has,
and it's coming back to the US, to have some venues to show.
We'll see. I'm in the process of trying to charm people into showing it. I think it's going to.
You're so charming. I can't imagine that not happening.
Well, we'll see. It's going to Rowan University Gallery to start off with, which is good because I don't have to store it all then, which is a slight problem with this piece. Especially as I keep on painting more, and I'm sure that some of you will send in sites.
That's what I was just going to ask you, was that you have done about 270 to date, and you have another 100 already submitted that you're still working on, is that right?
Yes, but I mean, you go to the top of the list at this point if it's from a place that I don't have. And also if you submit a really like affecting and beautiful story, then I tend to be like, oh yeah, this person really is keen. And then also if like more than one person submits something, you know, like sometimes you get a whole group of people where I'm just like, do you all know each other? You know, so we wonder sometimes. But yeah, as you can see, the end of the piece is still kind of, the black and white ones are unfinished. So I put a couple of unfinished ones in so you can tell that the project isn't finished. And they're all meant to look, they're all painted just in acrylics, black and white, and then glazed with oils. They're meant to look like those sort of old postcards, you know, that had the names on them. So they all have the name, and then the date is the date when it ceased to be in some form or another. And if there isn't a date, it's because I couldn't figure it out. You know, I do check to make sure they're gone, but you know, some things, you know, they sort of just disappeared, and nobody's really quite sure.
So you haven't been selling them individually, but there is some talk possibly of a print run for some of them.
Yes, I've been thinking about what to do with this project. I think it has to stay together, which is going to be a real challenge to find a home for it, I'm sure. But for people who take part in it, I'm thinking of, because a lot of people have wanted to buy their paintings, I'm thinking of making prints that will be at cost plus a little bit of a markup so that I'm not totally destitute. But then also I'm going to make a very limited print run of the project as well, so that if people are interested in a particular one, that more than one person can purchase them. And I like the idea of it being something that's financially also accessible to people, so it's not prohibitive.
So your career, you've done so many public projects. I mean, I suppose something like the Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship would have really helped you along. It gives you a cushion to concentrate on works like that.
Yes, I mean, something like that is fantastically helpful. You know, I mean, obviously I do sell work as well, so that's also, you know, I mean, like the Salzburg Museum just bought one of the pieces I made for that show. So I've been very fortunate that a lot of institutions and collectors do support me.
So the hope is that some private collector will come along and buy the whole
and donate
suite.
it to someone, maybe.
Yes,
I don't know.
I
don't
actually
know.
really would feel that this should be in a public collection.
It's a public piece.
It's so generous to the public that it really needs to be acquired by a proper museum.
We'll see what happens. You know, as an artist, you can cast your bread upon the waters, and you just never know what will happen. That's one of the fun part of it.
Before we open it up to the audience to see if anyone has any questions, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your next project. Was it Utopia that you are working on that I don't know anything about, that we'd love to know a little bit about?
I've been doing this fellowship, which I'm going to go and finish when I get back to the States with the Smithsonian Museum. They have this artist research fellowship. And I've been working with their patent collection. And they have this amazing collection of patent drawings and old patent models. You used to have to make a model to show how your little machine would work. And there was this thing where they used to all be exhibited every year. They would exhibit all of these patents. And they'd also have a room of failed patents. So you could go and be inspired. You'd be like, well, I think I know how to make that work, you know. And I thought, it was sort of part of this idea of a citizen inventor. So I'm thinking of making something, because this is all quite sad in a way, because these are all gone. So I thought, I think I have to go to the future.
Optimism.
So I think I'm going to make like patent drawings of machines that create not real goods, but abstract goods, like happiness and, I don't know, beauty and kindness. All the things that, you know, like, you know, we'll grow some more trees, you know, or things that I'd like to make sort of machines that, designs for sort of machines to create things that people want more of that aren't material goods. You know, we live in a world that's very focused on things, but in some ways it's the intangible things that really make life worth living. And so I'm interested in creating some projects that will maybe create a conversation about that.
Very exciting. Very exciting.
Well, we'll see. I haven't made it yet,
Yeah,
so
but you will
could be
always
terrible.
you always imbue it with some. It's actually quite necessary as well when you think about like how our advances in science and our advances in like kind of almost post-scarcity living. They've
Yeah.
always been inspired by artists projecting ideas of utopias. So I think we need that projection of optimism for the future in a way going forward. So it's a really important role that an artist can play within that.
Well, I think we live in a time where, every movie you see or every young adult book that your child reads, in my case, they're all dystopias.
Exactly.
And in some ways, the whole idea of utopian thought just been getting a bad rap because people just like, oh, it'll just all end in disaster. But at the same time, you do need some kind of collective imagining
Exactly.
to move forward. And maybe that can be a kind of collective imagining that also is diverse, that involves a lot of different ideas, rather than being so top-down, which I'm not a big fan of.
Exactly.
Would anyone in the audience have a question for? I knew we can rely on you, Bernadette.
I have to just say thank you, Bernadette, because Bernadette, you have to go and stand next to your painting. Go on, go on. No. Go on.
Yeah, this is the home that Bernadette grew up in the B&B.
That's fantastic.
And so she was great to submit a work.
Yay!
I'm really delighted that you put it in between two music venues.
It's a party at your house, No, but that was lovely.
What I wanted to ask you, Ellen, was about your process, your technique process, technical, I should say, and also about kind of the role of repetition in your work, because, I mean, this is amazing, it's spectacular, it's so great to see it, and so great to be part of it as well in a little small way. So thank you. But like you told me, you started in 2019. You take it to work. Jesus. So how you go about doing them, how many, how long it takes you to do it, and also that role of repetition, because you just mentioned that you're interested in patterns, which I really love. The idea of just working with that kind of meditative drawing thing. So would that be part of how you think or how you feel when you're working, that it's almost like a meditation rather than a kind of process where you're very active and moving around? Do you sit down to start off with?
I think I have a really hard time starting projects.
Okay.
I spend a lot of time obsessing about what a new work should be, and then I do test versions of it and do all this different, and then once I've decided, because I hate having to make lots of aesthetic decisions on the fly, like I can't decide what to wear in the mornings, let alone I always admire painters, or people who do stuff that's like really sort of emotional, and they're making all these decisions while they're working, but I'm not that person. Like I have to sort of have a decision, make the decisions first, and then I can relax and just make the piece. So this has been a great project, because it is like, you have a sort of mad history teacher who's telling you what to do, and then you have, you have to find the image and then figure out which image you want to use and make sort of small aesthetic decisions. But it's really fun to just paint them, actually. It's like it's a great, I was saying, it's a bit like that sort of, dopamine hit that you get from some of those social media things where you're like, oh, look, someone's talking to me. Oh, look, a new picture. It's a little slower than like flipping through Instagram.
And you design all the fonts.
And I did all the fonts. I just pick the fonts for each one. And there's always a lot of back and forth. You and I, when you sent in your home, you had a photograph of what it looks like today. And I was like, well, what did it look like before? And you sent me all this information. There's often a lot of back and forth about what people, if it's something that they personally remember, that it's not something where it's just kind of top down me deciding. But painting the thing itself is just fun. It's just like you're just sitting there, just painting away. I do a drawing first, and then I do the painting. You can see some of the under drawings in the unfinished ones over there. And I mean, and I paint differently for different projects. So this is kind of quite graphic because you have to be able to see it from a distance. And then it has to be interesting close up and from a distance. Because I hate it when something is really amazing from far away and then you come up close and you're like, oh, now I'm bored. So, I'm trying to avoid that. But I also paint, much more sort of, I know, romantically or realistically, like sort of with the Twin Planet protest, So.
There was
about
Sorry,
romance, the beautification of New York
just gonna
project
say
was,
this, and
was such
just
an
thinking
amazing
about
one. There's a
this,
book
yeah.
there's a couple of catalogues out at the
Yeah.
reception that you should take a look at to get a sense of the breadth of the projects that Ellen has been involved with. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, because that's a different approach to painting that combines with graffiti as well, and was a wonderful project that evolved.
Well, that was my sort of my brief career as a public criminal. It was time when it was while Giuliani was mayor, and he was arresting a lot of graffiti artists, and you couldn't help noticing that they tended mainly to be young men of color who got arrested, or certainly young men. And I was in my 30s, and I thought, early 30s, and I thought, well, I'm like the perfect demographic to be a criminal, really. I should just try it out. So I thought, well, what would be the opposite of like a regular graffiti tag? And I was like, I'm so uncool. So I was like, I'm going to do like a tag that's like a little, I made little kind of romantic 18th and 19th century landscapes about this big, and I tagged graffiti sites in the city. I did get beaten up once by the police, but they explained it was because they thought I was a homeless person. And then they were like, do you have permission? And I was like, well, I don't know if one of the meatpacking district has seen me. And they go in and they're like, you can't have permission. It was so Kafkaesque. They were like, because the owner's dead. And I was like, well, how do you know it wasn't his dying wish? Honestly, but I did not say that because I'm a sensible person. And said they were just like, So, but it was a project that was intended to create a discussion about who is allowed to make public art, and whether, if you have very kind of, should we say, conservative aesthetics, does that trump illegality? Because they're painted. I mean, they were little oil paintings, like literally painted directly on the graffiti
in that oval shape as well.
And so for each one, I spent sort of 3 days breaking the law in public. And then the book has all the stories of what happened, because obviously, I had all kinds of people come. Some of my favorites were all these sort of young graffiti guys who would just be like, where's your crew? And I was like, I don't have a crew. And they would be like, okay, we're watching out for you. And people were incredibly nice to me. People brought me sandwiches. It was just, I did a version of that piece on the secession in Vienna, and people just kept on calling the police on me. It was a completely different experience. The people in Vienna are a lot more law-abiding.
We had many years ago Barry McGee, who's a painter
yes,
and
he's
sculptor.
amazing.
And
Are those the skateboards in your house?
No,
Those aren't
no, but he did a few tags around Kilkenny. He actually did one on the old men's toilets that were on the parade. And he did a tag on the door, and he also did a tag on the stone fair sign. And before the guys demolished it, I asked if we could take them. So we have the door.
Oh,
we have a door in our storage, and we have the stone fair sign with a beautiful little face on it.
Amazing.
Oh, it's amazing.
But he did a few while he was around Kilkenny, because he's amazing, really interesting artist. You should look up his past exhibition. With
he's awesome. His work is tremendous. Yeah, mine was much more of a kind of joke on the idea of graffiti.
The combination of your romantic landscape with these, big black tags and lettering was just extraordinary.
It was a fun project to do. I mean, it was also fun just because it was at the beginning of starting to really interact with the public, because part of me was just like, I was like, no, I am beautifying the city of New York. Of course, I mean, it was very tongue-in-cheek, but people would come and talk to me all the time. And I did a lot of projects that ended up being based on that, So I did projects where I sat in the public and did portraits of people, and then people could write critiques of their portraits, and then I would mail them the portraits, and they were all terrible because I'm not very good. And I did them in 15 minutes. But I love this idea. You go, people will be like, well, will you come to my house and paint my house? Or will you come and paint my cat? So I think it's always interesting what people want from art. I think that's, we live in this world where art is this like little world, and it could be, I'm like, what is an artist for, really? It's a good, I don't know. I'm still asking that question. I don't know.
Might there be any other questions in the group here? No? Yes, Emily-Ann?
I'm always really interested in how people depict buildings or architecture and spaces. And you talked about how it was a very emotional experience connecting with people and their choice or selection of spaces. But yet there's no people within the images. Was that conscious, and why?
Well, I mean, we're social creatures, so if you put a person in a painting, everyone looks at the person. So part of it is that. And I also wanted them to be a little timeless, so then you look at people and you're like, oh, look what they're wearing. You can kind of tell maybe when it was. And I wanted also just to, people have this sort of intense love of place, or, of maybe a building, a tree, a landscape. I wanted to really just do justice to that. And some of these are really tragic sites, right? Like, I mean, we have Grenfell Tower. Like painting that, I was just like, oh my God, what if somebody comes and they've lost someone? And, it felt like some of these felt incredibly weighty. So I wanted them just to be just the building.
It's also the archetype of the postcard image as well, too. Like when you go pick up these postcards of these buildings, there are no people.
It depends. Some of them do, but you're right. Many nowadays, it's you don't generally have people.
Yeah.
But some of the older
I'm just thinking
ones.
of like scenes from Barcelona, these
True.
buildings and things like that. You're like buying. It's almost like you're buying the postcard of the building or something.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah. Sorry, daydreaming.
No, it's true.
I was going to ask one other question because, I mean, this kind of practice you have of which is kind of rooted in the vestige of classical painting in a way. How did that kind of butt against, say, the Whitney Independent Study Program? Because you undertook the Whitney Independent Study Program, I'm not sure when.
Yeah, just before the New York Beautification Project.
Just to give a bit of context, it's like this very interesting program that's a satellite to the Whitney, and it's run by Ron Clark. And it's like an incredibly conceptually rigorous program where you're really kind of tested like a mental athlete, really, on the context of making.
10 years before.
Oh, did you?
This is why Anna is a mental athlete. I think of myself more as a bit of a mental cripple.
But it's so anti-making art.
It's
it's like
art,
very theoretical, and you know all your theory as well. You're an artist who's very equipped to talk about her work as well. But I suppose that's just part of the growing up period. You take a year to go down this avenue of semiotics and theoretical theory and all of that, and then you stop and you take it in and you leave it aside and you make the work that you want to make. But it affects it in some way,
that's
though.
not really true, because the work that I make really comes out of all that theory. It was that year spent thinking about art that made me think about painting. And I was like, painting has lost all its functions, right? Like it used to be this thing, like you fell in love with someone and you got a painting of them and you were like, oh, it's my painting of my beloved. Or you went somewhere and you went to Venice and you had Canaletto make you a painting, which is also kind of a shout out to. But all these things, or you wanted to see the future, or you have like sort of, or the end of the world, you should get a painting. But now all of those functions are done by other things, other media. So painting really, I was like, what does painting have now? It's really just a signifier for art. Like when you see a painting, people are like, oh, that must be art. That's definitely art because it's a painting. But what else does it do, right? It's just, why is it, a painting why does that mean art to so many people? So it's a great place to start. Like I love all these old kind of techniques. So it's a great way to explore like what art is for and what people want from art and why you might make it and what it has to offer. So I think that actually, I think of my work as being very conceptually based, but I like to seduce people into thinking. So I want it to be, seductive. I want it to be, interesting to look at. I mean, you could be at home doing whatever you want to do, right? I mean, you've made the choice to come here. I want to give you something that's interesting to experience. So.
Which I think you have.
Yeah, space.
I think that's possibly a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Ellen, for contributing today, giving of your time. It's wonderful insight into Ellen's process, and Tell all your friends to come and see this show because it gives you so much back.
And I want to first say a huge thank you to Aideen, who first made the introduction and who was just such a pleasure to have in New York. I'm desolate that she's not going to be there anymore. And Anna, it's really been an honor to work with you. It's been such a pleasure. What a great place and what a great team.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. Thanks very much.
Yeah.